Hello, hello, hello. Yeah, hello, hello. Oh, there we go. That's some sound. I can hear myself. Everyone, hello. Welcome to Rail Live 2025. It's an absolute delight to have you along. Before I forget to say it, an enormous thanks to Pandrel, who are sponsoring the Engineering Theatre this year, as they did last year. Brilliant to have them along supporting us. Today, or rather this morning specifically, we are talking about rolling stock, trains to the normal people of the world. And I'm delighted to have an extremely prestigious panel with me. Ian Prosser as the former HMC Inspector of Railways here, and also now acting as Director of 00 Safety Consulting and providing support, ongoing support. No one in the rail industry ever retires, is basically what I've learned in my career. It never happens. Graeme Clark, Head of Business Development for Rolling Stock at Siemens Mobility. And Adam Sergent, who is Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at the Young Rail Professionals. So a range of perspectives on a bit that, I'm an infrastructure person, or I like to tell people I'm not, but the reality is I've spent my life being an infrastructure person. And there's the thing I used to tell my designers is, remember that we're not building a railway to just look at the nice static railway. We run trains on it. And then the thing you have to remind the trains people is, you're not just running a nice, pretty train. People have to get on it, or you have to put stuff in the train. And I think occasionally we've forgotten that in the last 30 years of rolling stock procurement, and that's kind of where I wanted to start. Yes, we're going to talk about strategic, big picture stuff later on, but I want to talk about maybe the lack of that for the last 30 or so years. Perhaps starting with Ian, with maybe what you might describe as a bit of a client-side view, perhaps. How would you characterise the last 30 years of procuring trains for the GB rail network?
Well, I think, obviously I was in my role for 16 years, so I saw a lot of to-in and fro-in. And things like sat on the McNulty, one of the McNulty panels. And I think there's just a legacy of inefficiency. And we wasted money. And we haven't actually provided, in some cases, the rolling stock that actually people want or like. And I still hear complaints about some of the modern stuff when I'm sitting on a train, both from the staff and from the passengers, like the seats and all the rest of it. So there's been a lack of also a unified strategy for traction and rolling stock. You can't just do one and not the other. So you need a unified traction and rolling stock strategy. And that then means that you've got some opportunities to actually have something that's more efficient and effective. Because we've been scrapping trains that are perfectly good and keeping old ones that are getting pretty near their end of life, keep them going. And that's going to be a difficult job for the next few years anyway, because they're still going to be needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you touch on traction strategy, but of course one of the things that gets forgotten in traction strategy is also power supply strategy. It's not just putting wires up or deciding on what the alternatives to that are. It's also ensuring that there is enough juice flowing through the wires to run trains. North of York, I live in York, north of York, all wired to Edinburgh, and yet quite a few of the trains have to drop their pan north of York because there's simply not the power to get the electric trains running. So yeah. That big strategic picture, we'll certainly talk about rolling stock cannot be thought of in isolation. But Graeme, your view, perhaps from a provider perspective, a supply chain that at the moment across the board is being squeezed pretty hard. Yep. What are your views on the last 30 years of train procurement?
I think it's been a bit chaotic, to be quite honest. There's not really been much in the way of a strategy that we can follow. And I think one of the mistakes we're still making is we're not considering the railway as a whole. You can't consider the trains, the power supply, the traction supply, whatever you're doing separately. You've got to consider it as one piece to get the best solution. And I still don't think we do that. And I think now the mistake which we're continuing to make is we're being far too prescriptive in how we're specifying the equipment. Yep. And what we really don't want to see as a manufacturer is what we've always referred to as a coat hook spec, which is where the specification says, the coat hook's got to be 3 inches from the door and 6 inches from the ceiling. Just tell us you want a coat hook and leave the rest of it to us. But I'd like to see far more in the way of requirements-based output specifications rather than prescriptive ones. And we're still seeing very prescriptive specifications which are hindering our ability to deliver what we think is the best train.
What do you think has driven that? Do you think it's do you think it was the nature of the franchising system in that you had a lot of people being very specific about what they needed based on their contract requirements? Do you think Do you think it was that we, related to that, or perhaps unrelated to that, that we lost touch with the end user? Fancy way of saying, people who put their bums on the seats. What do you think drove that, that over specification, or the specification, bearing in mind the gaps in specification of things like level boarding and accessibility?
Yep.
What do you think led to those behaviours?
I think it's just totally disjointed.
Yeah.
And I think we had lots and lots of, not against consultants, of course, but we had lots and lots of different consultants with different ideas specifying different things. And probably trying to justify exactly what they were doing in terms of specifying those things. And when we get the spec, we all end up with a completely different train. We don't end up with the product that we want. And I understand that we've got the difference between third rail and 25 kV and this, that, and the other, but I really don't understand why a regional train on Northern, or a regional train on Scotland, or a regional train in the in the west of England has to be different. Yeah. We need access to it. We need it to be efficient. We need it to run properly. We need it to accelerate well. We need it to be reliable. The requirements are there. So say that's what you want, and let the manufacturing industry produce a product based on a platform that achieves that.
Yep. Adam, I want to think, I've talked big in terms of thinking about passengers, but not actually really talked about it yet. What do you think train procurement has looked like to passengers, to the people who use the railway for the last, 30 years? And not all bad, I'm sure, but what's your view?
Well, I think if you look 30 years ago, back in the early 90s, before the days of privatisation, a lot of the rolling stock was like Mark 1s, Mark 2s, and I know that Mark 3s, they did have like disabled toilets, they did have a better layout. And I think as privatisation kicked in with like the order for new trains, I'd say things did get better. So, for example, disabled toilets are now a lot bigger than what they were on the HSTs, and they are spread across throughout the train, rather than just being one in the middle of first class, for instance. And I think we have also looked at things like PRM. So, certain train classes can't be used anymore because of PRM requirements, which shows that we are trying to be as accessible as possible. I think there are some elements in which we do go backwards sometimes, and which I'll explain more later. And also, I think we also need to look at certain routes, because I have noticed certain routes and corridors have different needs and different barriers. So, for example, if you look at High Speed 1, you get so many cycles on there that there have been instances where I've seen passengers in wheelchairs unable to go to the toilet. And then you've got the East Coast Main Line, where you've got so many people going on holiday, and you've got all these suitcases that people are using the wheelchair bays, for instance, as luggage storage. You can put as many signs up as you want. The reality is, people are prepared to do it. People are prepared to be abusive if you object. And then you've also got to look at other groups like neurodivergence. It's really important that we have single seating. Now, many trains do have them, but there are some newer trains like the Class 800s that only have them for crew members. So later in future train design, we need to look at how we can increase individual seats to prevent things like bag blocking on busy trains.
So as we move, thanks Adam, as we move into the GBR world, into a world that is, well, the risk is that it's an over-centralised world, but also we're getting a changing balance, let's say, between centralisation, between devolution, which brings in potentially more challenges from a manufacturing perspective, and the relationship then with central government, in some cases more autonomy, in some cases less autonomy. At this point we still have not a huge amount of clarity on what that will actually look like. That makes it very difficult to understand how requirements will emerge and who those requirements will be for, but also managing a diverse range of requirements. Also, you have a diverse range of needs. And going back to Graeme, how do you, from your perspective as a manufacturer, what would you like to see that will make your life easier rather than harder? We already have challenges with, Network Rail's different routes has made it very difficult from a rolling stock introduction perspective, because you now have, 14, 15 different requirements rather than one. Yep. Are you worried that's going to get worse, or do you think there is cognizance of that within the team building up GBR? What have you seen? Well, conscious that Alex is in the audience.
I better be careful what I say, I guess.
Yeah.
But, we're all expecting great things, I think, of Alex.
Yeah, that's exactly.
There's no doubt about
that.
Yeah. But I think we'd like to see, and we've discussed this before, but we'd like to see much better planning, a strategy, which then leads to a pipeline, so that we can see what's fully funded for the next, say, 5 years or so. And then the way we work in Siemens is we have a pretty good view of what's going to happen over the next 5 years, as well as we can. because everything changes, and then we take a 10-year and a 15-year view as well. And that's good. We'd like to see we'd like to see bigger orders. So we'd like to see big frameworks rather than, because we spend about £100 million plus developing a platform, and it's a big commitment. And even for a company like Siemens, we have to go cap in hand to our lords and masters in Germany, and I'm sure Alstom do the same in France, and Hitachi do the same in Japan, and say, look, this is worth investing in. And they've got to be able to see a pipeline, and they've got to be able to see that platform is then going to spin off lots of particular opportunities. So bigger projects would work for us. And the key thing as well is if you take things like decarbonisation, using discontinuous electrification and battery trains is not an expensive way of decarbonising. It's a very, very cost-effective way of decarbonising, which if you want to electrify the routes fully later on, you can then expand it because it still operates off the same overhead line. But let us come up with a solution to what the problem is. And in terms of that, basically we were told, look, reduce the cost of the railway, make this railway more efficient, make it more reliable, give it better performance. And Siemens, and our competitors are doing similar things, have developed rail charging converters, discontinuous electrification and battery trains. Things like level access, we can produce level access trains. The new train we're launching will have level access. It's not difficult, it's an easy thing to engineer. The problem we have is that we've got supposed to have platforms that are 3 foot above rail, and I think it's 7% of them that are actually at 3 foot above rail. But if you're clever about it, you can give access to about 85% of the population, unassisted access, but give us a chance to innovate. Don't be too specific. And the other thing I would say is, don't keep changing your mind. Let's have a consistent strategy that runs across parliaments, so that we can perhaps argue about how we get to a particular place, but let's at least agree where we're trying to get to.
So an emerging theme there, and I suspect an emerging theme throughout our entire programme today and tomorrow, is the opportunity of having a unified railway again will be that we can start squaring the circle of the relationship between traction, power supply, platform positions, accessibility, even things like depot space and all these sorts of things, and the trains themselves. But this brings up a challenge, and Ian, I'm going to throw to you on this one, which is a safety, a standards, and a regulatory side, is that with a very much changing picture, how can we ensure that we are getting things like electromagnetic compatibility, so the buzzing, if you plug your phone in or someone rings you while it's charging, get that horrible buzzy noise. Well, that's irritating if you're on a call. It can be train switchy offy in extreme situations. So things like that require robust standards, robust understanding requirements, and the relationship between them. How do we manage that in a changing environment in terms of where the funders are, where the client organisations sit, and who's setting out specifications?
Well, I think it's just like it is part of a strategy. A rolling stock and traction strategy is to have a clear idea what standards you're going to build the trains to. So that one of the things I saw in the 16 years was a lot of chopping and changing. And that led to difficulties actually, if it had been more standardised, led to more difficulties with software. We had lots of issues sometimes with software. New suppliers coming into the market, and we had problems obviously with the Hitachi trains, which is well publicised. And we had to, as a regulator, to deal with all of that. And and at times I think, as I think has already been mentioned, that the specification seemed to come from a particular franchise. So it was very disjointed and completely sort of disjointed, so that there was no sort of thread. So we've ended up with different platforms. And part of I think the challenge going forward is the fact of where we are today. We're in an environment where the money is tight. But we've also got rolling stock that we've scrapped that was perfectly good. And then we've got old aging diesel fleets that are getting beyond their life. So we've got quite a difficult position to actually go forward with. And it's just to me, having worked in the chemical industry for 20 years before I joined rail, this is the sort of thing that's not difficult if you get it right. And you can have very long-term contracts. You can have, but you standardise on a design and then you get on with it. and it takes into account the things that people want.
Trains, with a shelf life of, say, 40 years, it does seem daft to not think 40 years ahead when it comes to procurement. And that's those sorts of time, whatever, we're 25 years away from 2050. 2050 is a big, scary future year. It's also not that far away. And it's within the lifetime of the trains that we are currently procuring. So one thing that's emerged I want to just touch on, which is might not be a conflict, but there is a combination of, Ian, I agree with you on this, standardization is really important. At the same time, Graeme, you're saying that you don't want to be over-specified or too much of a detailed specification on what you deliver from a manufacturer's perspective. Graeme, do you see that as an incompatibility, the need for overall standardization versus you being allowed as Siemens to innovate and optimize your solution? How do you see that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, as Ian said about the standards we work to and the interfaces we've got to have, I mean, we've got to meet those requirements. There's no doubt about that, and it's got to meet all the safety requirements. It's implicit in everything we do. But I don't think that is an issue. And if you take a train that Alstom would build or a train that Stadler would build, inevitably it would be different to the one we would build, because we've got different technologies and we've all got different control systems. And I would like to say that it's very easy to make one of our trains talk to somebody else's, but it isn't. It's very, very difficult to do, actually. And that's something that perhaps we should consider. But I'm not really sure where it's been done successfully. I mean, there's things like the ABB networkers and the GC networkers, but I'm not sure they ever actually talk to each other particularly well. But I don't think it is. I think it's absolutely fine. But what we want to be able to do is to have sufficient scope to be able to bring our technologies and our innovation to the railway. But it's got to interface with the infrastructure overall. So I don't think it's a mismatch in any way. No.
Adam, I'll come to you in a minute. But Ian, I'm going to bounce back to you because another thing that I've thought of is one of the things that GBR clearly needs to be ready to do is think about innovation around contracting and around procurement as well, because our framework, if we've got a contract for I want this many trains and I want them to be here at this time, that contract is clearly not capable of then thinking about, well, it also ties into the electrification, the power supply upgrade, and also by the way, the ETCS relationship as well, the control of the trains. So we clearly have, the contracting strategy. We need to be really, what do you think about do you think it's realistic to suggest that the future in procuring trains has to actually not be about procuring trains, but about much more of a train system and think about the broader picture? How do we make that work? Does it work? Is it possible?
I think it's possible. I think it is important to think of the system. And, particularly with ECTS coming along. And your point, we need to be thinking about beyond 2050. We need to be thinking those sort of time frames, because a lot of what we've got now is going to be here still in 25 years' time. So we do need to think that way far forward. And also I think we've got a bit of an issue in some of the existing fleets that are going to come to their life end. We need to think about how we sort that out first. Yeah.
There are a lot of sprinters out there, and there is currently not a replacement for them.
That's one of the issues we've got. So I think it's just be a bit more. I think the other thing in some cases that the tenders got very detailed and specific. So you're tying down the supplier.
Yep.
So you don't need to be too specific and too detailed to give them a bit more scope. But then also the supply chain, if it's got an understanding of the longer term, they can invest and deliver on its part of the bargain, which sometimes that hasn't happened in the past, so that we actually get the trains that we need. So things like that's being developed here, the testing loop, because we've had difficulties with the introduction of trains, so we need to make sure the whole package is delivered in an efficient way.
Adam, I want to talk a little bit about, one of the things that's important about GBR is, in my view, is democratization. It's a thing that we as a rail industry have become very hermetically sealed away from the people who actually use our systems. It's very difficult for passengers or the public at large to feel like they have any real handle on what we're up to as an industry. It's like the railway happens over there and then maybe I'll use it. I don't feel like I have any control over that system. One of the ways that people do interact with train systems is through focus groups and through passenger groups and others. But Adam, what are the ways that people currently get involved with specifying, involved with what their train should look like? And do you think we should be considering expansion of that, or how do you think GBR should be thinking about the direct relationship with the people who will actually sit on those trains, or work their way onto them, or stand on them, depending on where you are in the country?
Well, at the moment, as you probably all know, there are customer panels, and I've been on some of them myself. And the one thing that I have noticed with the customer panels is I think passengers are using it more as an opportunity to complain about how things currently are, rather than the design of the future, rather than future design. And I think it's really important that all talks and GBR have a section within those panels to say, here's our train, what do you think of this, what do you think of that, how do you think this complies with PRM, and get the feedback there and then. And then that should not only reduce complaints in the future, but it should also help future-proof what we need to do in the future. And it's not just necessarily looking at the passenger groups. You've also got to look at other industries as well. I mean, the bus industry, they recently did a new design on things like flooring, maquetting, and seating and poles. And those workshops have worked out really well. And you got companies like Neomind who have got these fantastic new products that they're going to be releasing soon. And I think we need to work more closely with our passengers and also work with our operators as well, because it might be that one operator or talk might have a different view to another, and only when you collaborate, that's when you really get to find out.
I think one of the we know about union involvement in specifying trains from a driver end. We know that it's, if you want the drivers to have a good time in the train, then you get the unions in early, you make sure they're happy with the way that train looks and how increasingly how the user interface of the ETCS functions. One of the things, of course, we're maybe not so good at is everyone who runs the train behind that, and not even just train managers, guards, but cleaning staff who are perhaps not as well represented by unions. So that's another factor in that, is ensuring that we're building trains that not only passengers enjoy, not only drivers and staff enjoy, but also the cleaners, those staff who we maybe don't think about as often are finding those trains easy to use and easy to clean. Let's talk strategy. You're all here to talk about strategy. I've been dancing around the subject a little bit, but I wanted to set the scene. What the hell is a strategy going to look like? What does it actually materially look like? I think the person to start with is Graeme. What do you want a strategy to look like? You already alluded to 5 years would be nice, but 5 years of what? You get an A5. The risk is that the government creates a 25-page PDF that says it would be nice if we talked about what trains need to be doing into 2040. But actually what you probably need is an Excel spreadsheet that says we need this many that are going to have this much capacity and this, and it's going to be here. But what does it look like? What do you want it to look like?
From a personal point of view, I'd like to see a strategy that says we're going to get rid of diesels.
Yep.
We're not going to build any more diesels. We're not going to hide behind the fact that a diesel bi-mode is still a diesel.
Yep.
We say, we won't buy diesels, but diesel bi-modes are okay. They've still got a bloody great diesel engine in there. And I'd like to see a strategy which says, and I'm hoping GBR are going to do this, but which says that we are going to head towards a fully electric railway, because I don't think anybody would argue that an electric railway everywhere is the best way to go. It's not affordable. It's going to take a long time to get there, and I think the calculation says that if we invested in 200 single-track kilometres every year, it would take us 50 years to do it all. And some of the routes, obviously, perhaps at the top end of Scotland, or...
It's worth interrupting even just to say, to meet the government's own net zero targets, we need to be electrifying around about 400 to 500 single track kilometres a year from now. That's to meet the government's own legally binding net zero targets.
Exactly.
Whoops.
Exactly. But you can start with things like the discontinuous electrification, which gives you electric train performance. It's affordable. It's not expensive. And then you can build on that, because it's not a different kind of electrification to what you'd normally see. It's just 25 kV power. And you can expand that, you can strengthen it later on, and eventually head towards an electric railway. So at the top level, I'd like to see things like that says, by a certain date in the future, we are going to have a fully electric railway. And we can start by saying, well, no more diesels. We don't need diesels. There's a better technology. It's cheaper. It's more efficient. It's cleaner. I'd like to see much, much better definition of what we're trying to achieve environmentally, because we look, and the train we're developing now, all the trains we develop, we look at the Department of Transport's advisory guidance, the TAG guidelines, which allocate costs to emissions and particulates and all things like that, but I've not yet seen a specification that takes any of that into account. So they're the sort of things I'd like to see in a strategy to say exactly where we're going to end up. We might not, first of all, know exactly how we're going to get there, but by whatever it is, we want to be in a position of a fully electrified railway or not operating diesel trains. Things like accessibility. It's going to take a long, long time to make the railway fully accessible because, as you say, it's 35, 40-year life of a train. And we're still building trains which have got nothing in the way that the Siemens aren't, but trains are still being delivered in the UK which have got terrible accessibility, and we're still buying them. And I think we need to understand where we want to get to and start putting the big building blocks in place and let's say get on with it. Because it's the old story, you wouldn't start from here. But if we always say that, then we'll always end up with a suboptimal railway. But I think we've got a fantastic chance to make a difference now.
Ian, do you think, in fact, let's flip that on its head. My argument is actually, short of a rolling stock strategy, what we need, and Graeme agrees, is a commitment to a mission. Do you think we will get that? Do you think this or any government will be able to, Treasury is who I'm speaking about specifically, do you think Treasury will actually commit to something like that? Because the good thing for us as an industry is a commitment like that lets us get our ducks in a row, particularly if you're going, by the way, we're all taxpayers. I hate the phrase taxpayers' money. It's like, yeah, I'll be paying tax my entire life. So that's 80 years of tax. Maybe if we thought about tax income over that time scale, we'd maybe make more efficient and better spending decisions. You know, do you think it's possible that we will get a commitment out of Treasury?
I think the thing we have to do is, I think, first off, the point about having a proper vision. And a coherent strategy starts with a vision, you know, where we want to be. And then if it's coherent, and the thing about the Treasury is that they can pick holes here. So, you know, and they'll be picky. And sometimes I've seen people go with proposals to the Treasury and it's not been well thought through. Some of the things that have happened in the last 5-10 years have not been well thought through. So, but if you go there with a real plan, you know, and it may be 50 years out, but then they can get their head around it. They're going to have to do that for defence, for example. You know, that's the same sort of thing, environment we're living in. You know, you have to plan long term. Those assets last 40, 50 years, and they need to build them better than they have done in the last 20 years as well. So, you know, it's the same sort of issue. You've got it, and then you can demonstrate the efficiencies you'll get by having more longer-term delivery, for example, or plans. So then that's when you get the efficiencies. We've ended up in a situation where we've got not a very great product to some extent, without having, you know, with very inefficient way of getting there. And we still haven't got a view of where we want to be.
Yeah, it comes back to the fact that we're in a situation where we as a railway don't have a mission. We haven't got our objective. We had a paper just before the general election that alluded to what could be a mission, you know, mode share, raising mode share up, doubling rails, passenger and freight capacity by 2035, in fact, was what Jürgen Meyer said, which is pretty aspirational. That could be a good mission because what that tells us usefully is, well, to do that, you need this many trains moving around because that's how many people move around. And that then gives you, well, we'll need this many trains by this year and so on and so on. But what that tells me is that we don't just need a rolling stock strategy. We don't just need a rail strategy. We need a strategy for government to say, well, this is what we want in terms of how people will move around the country. And that requires some serious leadership. So, big strategic questions out there floating around. Some very interesting sort of, hopefully some useful stuff that we can get kind of chew through as well. Not too much esoteric stuff. There is some material, as Graeme has laid out, some actual material things that we expect to see as an industry. But what can we do to help, I suppose? So it's all very well saying we want this. What can we do as an industry to help government to give us the right answer, as it were? What can we provide them? You know, I suppose, Graeme, briefly to you, what do you think we can do to help to help government to know what that strategy should look like?
Well, I mean, we, as Siemens, you probably saw Sambit in a Transport Select Committee meeting, I think it was last week or the week before, I can't remember, explaining, together with Peter Broadley from Alstom, explaining exactly how the industry works, exactly how we'd like to see things going forward. So I think we need to try and work with customers, work with government, work with all our suppliers at every level we possibly can, work with every influencing group and every stakeholder to try and get a consensus as much as we can as to where we should be going. And it's a big job, it's difficult, but I think if I go back to the discontinuous electrification argument and the battery trains, I think 2 years ago everybody thought that was crazy. Now Wales have got it running and it's brilliant. I don't know if you've ridden on they're not my trains, they're Stadler trains, but they're great. And the discontinuous electrification works well. So I think people are now starting to say, oh, there's something here, this actually works, this is deliverable. And I think there's a groundswell where that's gone to people now realise that's possible to do. And I just think we need to keep pushing and pushing and pushing at all levels so that we can influence as many people as we possibly can to focus people in the right direction. Give you another stupid example of things we have to do. We're at the moment involved in 3 rolling stock procurement opportunities. And we've got 3 sets of lawyers we're dealing with for 3 different companies, and they're completely different terms and conditions. It's 3 fleets of trains. Why do we have to have different T's and C's? You know, we just make things so difficult for ourselves because that triples the work that everybody's got to do. All right, the lawyers might like it because they're making a lot of money out of it, but we don't.
Adam, I wanted to end with you because one of the things that maybe doesn't get cited is not just that a long-term strategy saves us all money because you can make much more sensible, clever spending decisions, but also it gives young people who are joining the industry an interest in doing that. It actually gives people who are joining the industry a future that they can see. They can see us having a role in the industry in the long term. Do you think as an industry we do a good enough job of showing what strategies mean in terms of people, in terms of what that means in terms of us as people having an opportunity to, a vision of what we could be doing in the industry 20, 30, 40 years down the line?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's different ways that it's currently been done. So, for example, over at TfL, they've got the youth panel, and they kind of like help out with what they want to see going forward with TfL. You've also got the apprenticeship programs that many train companies have, and from there it gives those who are on them a real opportunity in designing, building, testing, engineering rolling stock, for instance. And then you've got the graduate programs, which are kind of similar. But I think one thing that we need to do is to help inspire more people into STEM roles. So yesterday I was at the Big Bang Theory in Birmingham, and they were saying that if it's those that are in year 6 and year 7 who really need to know about this stuff, and they need to know about it quick.
So it's that vision, and the one thing, strategy might sound pretty kind of grey, but actually the potential for that strategy to inspire the engineers of the future, those involved in the industry, is unending. I want everyone to say thank you to the panel. Thank you so much. Thanks to Pandrel. Thanks to all of you for joining. I'll see you all in about 10 minutes for next, I hope. Thanks so much.